Welcome everyone, this is Honest Restart, and today I want to talk about the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now recently I put out a video talking about my Nintendo Direct predictions for September. I think there's going to be a September Nintendo Direct. But in my predictions, I am predicting that there will not be a big presence for Breath of the Wild 2. And I could be wrong, for sure, but I also could maybe be right. And the reason why I think that there will not be any presence for Breath of the Wild 2 in a September Direct is because, one, there isn't necessarily a need, but also because I think Breath of the Wild 2 is more likely a holiday 2022 release at this point. So, when will we see more information on Breath of the Wild 2? That's what I sort of want to talk about today in this video, sort of talking about how Nintendo could go about marketing and hyping up Breath of the Wild 2, leading up to its eventual release, hopefully by the end of 2022. So that's what we're talking about today. Now before we jump into things, let me very quickly talk about my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check that all out. It is linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe. So before we jump into the scenario of there not being any presence of Breath of the Wild 2 in a September Direct, let's first talk about a scenario where maybe there is. And this is all hypothetical because we still haven't even gotten a confirmation of a September Direct. It's just simply likely based off every single year the last 5 years or so. But if we do see Breath of the Wild 2 in the Direct, what would we see exactly? What would they give us? Would they give us another trailer similar to what we got at E3? Would they give us a full-blown trailer with a lot of gameplay details, more like a 3 to 4 minute trailer? Something similar to what we got back at January 2017 when they gave us that final huge trailer for Breath of the Wild, and then the game came out 2 months later. Could it be something like that? If it is something like that, then I think that would imply that the game is coming out sooner than later, and potentially it is the big game that comes out to close out Nintendo's fiscal year, which would be March of 2022. We have been getting a lot of big games to close out their fiscal years the last few years. Monster Hunter Rise, Animal Crossing New Horizons. If we go back to the beginning, it was Breath of the Wild along with the Switch, March of 2017. So if that is sort of what Nintendo is aiming for, then I would expect Breath of the Wild 2 to be shown off to some great capacity during the September Direct, because potentially this could be the last big Direct before the end of the year. I mean, it probably will be based off historical precedents in terms of general Directs, it will be. But also, there usually is like an earlier Direct as well, so conceivably they could wait until the beginning of the year, but usually that general Direct is in February or March, and if the game's coming out in March, they would have had to have talked more about it by that point, I think. So if Breath of the Wild 2 is coming out by March of 2022, then this September Direct is where they need to start really blowing out details here. So maybe that happens, you know, they didn't tell us when in 2022 it's coming out exactly. But that kind of brings me to my point from the beginning of the video. I don't think it's coming out that early. And one of the reasons why is because when they showed off the game at E3 2021, it wasn't extensive. We didn't get a full blowout of the game. We didn't get a lot of details. There weren't a lot of interviews. There was no treehouse spot for Breath of the Wild 2. And after that short, about 90-second some trailer, Eiji Aonuma told us that they are aiming for a 2022 release. That phrase has an inherent lack of confidence in its release date for 2022. Now you could say that maybe I'm looking too deep into the phrase, and potentially I am, but the way it's worded, I would say it's more of a humble phrase, which is something that Nintendo tends to do during the Directs. They try to be very humble about when they're aiming for projects and such, because they don't want to guarantee something and then disappoint fans. So while they are giving us a 2022 tentative release year, there is that potential that they don't even make it out for 2022, that it comes out even later. It should be noted, we are still going through a lot of issues with the pandemic. There are the variants going around, there are issues in different parts of the country, there are issues in different parts of the world. It's an ongoing issue and it has created challenges. But at the same time, I do feel like for most of the video game industry, they have figured out a pattern, and they are moving forward. That's why we are getting these different announcements from Nintendo throughout the year. And it's gotten to a point where it feels like almost a normal year in terms of announcements. Last year it wasn't. But this year it does feel like that. We got an earlier direct, we got a summer direct for E3, and it's looking like we're going to be getting our fall September time direct. That all seems to be lining up similar to normal non-pandemic years. And I think the implication of that is that, okay, it seems like a lot of the development teams and studios that Nintendo works with are getting close to a norm, which decreases the chances of delays. I think that's a fair assumption, but that doesn't mean it's 100% true. They still do come out with that disclaimer at the beginning of the direct every time that, there's ongoing COVID issues and such, and this could lead to delays. So we have to take that into consideration. There is still an ongoing increased risk of delays across the board for all development, for all games right now. And I say that mostly to cover my bases. I still do think that most likely Breath of the Wild 2 will come out 2022 because they're saying it's going to come out 2022. A lot of people will point to the fact that there is a long history of the big 3D Zelda games getting multiple delays. That is true. Initially, the first Breath of the Wild was slated for 2015, presumably holiday 2015, but then it was delayed to holiday 2016, and then it was delayed to March 2017. It had 2 big delays. And with this release year, it's the first time Nintendo is giving us a date for Breath of the Wild 2. So if we assume it follows a similar pattern to Breath of the Wild 1, then the game is going to see at least one more delay, maybe a second one. But I don't think it would be fair to compare the two. I don't think it's a similar situation at all. Why? Because, well, one, they started development for Breath of the Wild 2 in 2017 at the end of the year. There are interviews saying that they started the next big Zelda project. They did reveal or announce the project in it being a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild at E3 2019, so they waited a little bit of a while before actually announcing what it was. But then they waited 2 whole years to give us more information on the game. That is not at all how it worked out for the initial Breath of the Wild. The initial Breath of the Wild was a ground-up new project, no established engine beforehand. I remember they showed off the initial sort of like tech demo or whatever for Breath of the Wild, Zelda U at the time. That was back at E3 2014. That initial trailer touted a 2015 release date. The initial trailer for Breath of the Wild 2 touted no release date at all. They were far more careful with that. So think about it, the timeline for Zelda U in terms of us finally seeing footage, they started off with that 2014 trailer. So from that initial trailer, which was summer 2014, they told us 2015 date, it saw 2 delays, and it didn't come out till almost 3 years later, March 2017. We look at Breath of the Wild 2, the game started development in 2017, but they didn't show it off until E3 2019, but this is a sequel that's already being built upon a foundation of Breath of the Wild, so that should expedite development. They didn't give us a release date. They waited 2 years, and then they told us, just a few months ago, that it'll be coming out 2022. If we assume it's holiday 2022, that's already a longer period of time between the initial reveal trailer for Breath of the Wild 1 and its release date, because that was less than 3 years by a few months, and with Breath of the Wild 2, we're looking at a situation where it could be 3 years and a few more months. But Breath of the Wild 2 is a sequel built upon the initial foundation. Development shouldn't take as long. Granted, there was COVID, so that could kind of balance things out a little bit, but if we consider that, then they're kind of on similar sort of tracks here. I don't think it's a situation where we're going to be seeing a couple more delays. I don't think we're that early on into development for Breath of the Wild 2 as we were with Zelda U when they gave us an initial release year. Actually, when they gave us that initial trailer back at E3 2019, Nintendo was a lot smarter about giving us information. They didn't tell us a release year because, well, they know how these things go with delays. If it was the same Nintendo showing us a trailer for Breath of the Wild 2 back then they would have told us, oh, the game's coming out 2020. They didn't do that. They didn't tell us a release year because they already understood there's a history of Zelda games taking longer than expected. So they waited 2 years before they were actually willing to tell us a release year. And I think because they were willing to wait, that tells us that there's more confidence in this release year. So I do think 2022 is probably going to be the year we see Breath of the Wild 2. But when in that year? Conceivably could still be March, but I still think it's going to be later because we only just got a 90-second trailer at E3. They didn't give us a lot of big gameplay details. They didn't really blow out the game. We didn't get that E3 presentation that just shows us all these different things about Breath of the Wild 2, where there's all this fanfare and information and interviews learning about the game. E3 is the biggest time of the year for showing off that information. Even if E3 itself isn't that big of a deal, that time period, that summertime period to show off information on games still is the biggest time of the year. So, I think we're probably going to wait for one more E3. I think E3 2022, we're going to be getting that massive blowout for Breath of the Wild 2. That's when we'll see the big, huge marketing push for the game, and it'll come out in the second half of 2022. I'm going to assume the holidays, because usually big 3D Zelda games come out during the holidays. Breath of the Wild 1 is an exception. A lot of people like to look towards the March 2017 release along with the Switch, but keep in mind, that was a unique situation. The game was actually delayed to that time, and part of that had to do with localization of both the Wii U version and the Switch version, but then also they wanted to have a big release game for the Switch. So all of that together led to the game not coming out holiday 2016, but March 2017. It would have been a holiday release is my point. So most likely I think it's fair to assume that a holiday 2022 release is the ideal sort of release period for Breath of the Wild 2 at this point. So then when do we get our next bit of information on Breath of the Wild 2? Well, I wouldn't be surprised if we still get another update on Breath of the Wild 2 this year. I feel like the Game Awards would actually be an ideal time for that. There are two franchises we've seen Nintendo use quite extensively at the Game Awards: Smash Bros. And the Legend of Zelda series, specifically Breath of the Wild. Smash Bros. Is ending its DLC this year. I'm assuming we're going to get the final character reveal in this upcoming September Direct. And with that end, there will be no more Smash to talk about. Sure, we'll get a Sakurai Presents maybe a week or so afterwards, but once that character comes out in either September or October, presumably Nintendo, Sakurai, and the Smash team will be done with Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. There will be no more to talk about with that game. And Nintendo likes to have somewhat of a presence at the Game Awards, usually one or two announcements. So then what will they talk about that will be befitting of that? Well, if it's not Smash Bros., maybe we should go to the other most commonly used franchise of the Game Awards by Nintendo, Breath of the Wild. We've already gotten 2 trailers. Presumably 2022 is the release year for Breath of the Wild 2. So timing-wise, it does make a lot of sense to put out another trailer, another little teaser in front of a large audience of the Game Awards and show us more Breath of the Wild 2. I think that is actually probably our best bet for our next opportunity to see more for the game. And then maybe they tell us more in an earlier Nintendo Direct, but I could see them skipping Breath of the Wild 2 again in an earlier Nintendo Direct to just fully blow it out at E3. But I do think we'll see some sort of teaser at the Game Awards. That's what I'm sort of thinking, then the big E3 blowout, and then a lead up of marketing and such for the next coming months, and then a holiday release for Breath of the Wild 2 with some sort of bundle, be it a controller or a Switch Breath of the Wild 2 version or something like that. That's what I'm sort of thinking. That's how I think Nintendo will lead up to a release for Breath of the Wild 2. And it's gonna be hype. It's gonna be exciting. We're gonna get information. Maybe not exactly when we want it to, but we are gonna get that information, and I think the game is going to release in time, and it's gonna be a really, really good product. That's what I'm thinking right now. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think we could see Breath of the Wild 2 during this supposed rumored September Direct? Do you think it's gonna be a little bit later, like I'm thinking? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.